All right, welcome back. And in part two of markets, information, and incentives, I want to talk about what happens when there's some sort of change in the market or how markets actually respond to different things that happen to them. So let me sort of break that down. Up to this point, we've talked about equilibrium and how we get there, right? We've talked about we talk about buyers and sellers and how they get together in markets and negotiate price, and some sort of equilibrium emerges, right? And presto, we have efficiency. Well, this interaction between buyers and sellers is a little bit more subtle, which I want to sort of get into some of the nuts and bolts of what exactly is going on here, which I've kind of given some anecdotes about what actually happens, but haven't quite broken it down in terms of the supply and demand just yet. So supply and demand, it helps us understand how markets work, so it should also help us understand how these prices emerge, and I underscore how here, right? Not just that, well, we get some efficient outcome, which seems pretty nice and neat, right? Ideally, we would like supply and demand to show us, well, how we get there and why it is efficient, right? What if we're not in equilibrium? What if we have a price where, the price seems to be a bit off? How does the market work, right? I don't just want to tell you that buyers and sellers get together, some sort of black box, and then all of a sudden, presto, magic, we have this magical result that seems pretty nice, and I keep going on and on about how great it is, but how did we get there? It seems to be sort of a black box. Well, this lecture, I want to talk about exactly how things work. So I'll give you an example. Suppose prices were too high, right? What do I mean by that? Well, in equilibrium, right, we have some equilibrium price, but let's suppose we're out of that equilibrium, right? What if we have a price that's, we had that $30, price in the previous lecture for a barrel of oil. Well, what if the price wasn't $30? Well, what happens in the market? Well, what happens is that this high price is an incentive. It's information to the markets, and the markets will respond. So what we see on the market when the price is too high is we see what economists call an excess supply or a surplus. How do we get that surplus? Well, this high price is giving the information to the markets to do the following, right? The high price is telling sellers, right? It's telling sellers that they should produce more, and it's telling buyers that they should cut back, right? Remember, from the laws of supply and demand, right, prices are guiding what they do, right? And we talked about this even in the previous lecture. So, law of demand, buyers want less when price is high, sellers want to sell more, right? This is just the natural, what naturally flows out of these laws, right? And so the result is a surplus, right? When you have sellers producing a lot of stuff, right? So let's say at $50 a barrel, sellers are going to be producing a lot, right? So let's say sellers produce 100 here. Again, these numbers are arbitrary, but just to sort of put this more concretely. Sellers produce, let's say, 100 million barrels of oil per day, right? Because at that high price, they think, or at least it may not be high in terms of today's terms, but higher relative to this equilibrium price here of $30, again, which is arbitrary. But just to illustrate here, at this high price, sellers are providing a ton of oil to the market. They think oil is very scarce, or at least the market's telling them, you should be producing a lot of oil because you can, make a lot of money selling oil at $50 a barrel, right? But buyers are seeing this high price and they're like, that's way too expensive. Oil is a key input to gasoline. And even when we're making our decisions for, let's say, the family trip in the summer, right? We may try to decide, well, should we drive across the country in a big RV, right? Or that's one option. Or some families may consider going somewhere more local, not renting the RV, not paying, buying so much gas, right? There's a high gasoline option. There's a low gasoline option. When gas is expensive because oil is expensive, you're more likely to choose the low gasoline option. Multiply this by millions of consumers who are sort of on the margin, sort of right close to being indifferent right here, and then you sort of get consumers only demanding 32 million barrels of oil. That's not to say that when prices are high, that people don't buy any at all, right? So even when the price of gasoline is really high, you'll still say, well, I still need to get to work. Sure, you need to get to work. But so for that gallon of gas, right, you may value that really highly, right? So you may be sort of up here in this part of the demand curve, right? You might be, have a large willingness to pay. But as far as when you're running your errands, right, you might be more strategic about trying to sort of get certain errands done that are in the same part of town, try to economize on gas even further, right? You might want to think through your trips and think through carpooling more carefully to try to use less gas, right? There's all sorts of ways in which you can economize on gas, or you can economize on just anything when the price is giving you that information to cut back as a buyer. So as a result, we have this big difference right here between how much the market is, how much is being provided by the market, and how much is being potentially bought by the market. And so this surplus, or this sort of inventory on the market, suggests that prices should go down, right? Whenever you see an excess supply on the market or some sort of big inventory in the market, how do markets respond? Well, they respond by cutting prices, right? You probably, depending on when you watch this video, you might be on, part of the year where, whether it's car dealerships who are trying to sell last year's inventory, right? Because they got a bunch on the lot and they need space on the lot for the New Year's inventory. You might be seeing all sorts of sales where they're like, well, we've got all this inventory here, we're slashing prices, right? The very fact that people have a bunch of inventory just sitting there is information that the market's using to tell them to cut prices. The used car lot people, or the new car lot people, or whatever example you want to use, or the people in the oil market, they may have no idea about the supply and demand for oil. They may not be able to draw you a supply and demand graph. But what they can tell you is that when they've got a bunch of inventory, that they're going to start slashing the prices because they want to get rid of this stuff because it's costly for them to maintain this inventory, okay? And so as a result, what you're going to start to see is price move back down towards equilibrium, right? You're going to see the surplus get less and less, and as price goes down, you're going to have fewer, in the next day, you're going to have fewer suppliers supplying so much oil, and you're going to have more buyers buying more oil as it gets cheaper. Ultimately, so you get to this equilibrium, right? That's sort of how you get this sort of nice, stable, no inventory kind of equilibrium where all of the buyers equals all of the sellers, right? So that's pretty neat, right? What's happening with this market process is if the market's wrong, there's this process through which people act within the market to sort of correct what's wrong in the market by following what prices are telling them, following what quantities are telling them, right? The quantity of stuff on the market is literally telling people to reduce price, and that price is going to tell buyers and sellers what to do, right? So all of this I've already just said, up to the point where you get to this sort of equilibrium, right? So next, how do sellers know the price is too high in a sort of free market system, okay? As I said, they just have to look at their shelves, right? Once they look at their shelves, once they look at their inventory, right, you see that they know to lower their price, and that's ultimately how they get to this equilibrium value. They don't just sort of negotiate with buyers and sellers, which happens in sort of our auction markets and what may happen in some instances, but in reality, in more established markets, right? They look at these sort of market cues to tell them how to behave, right? So the market can be wrong, right? The market can be wrong all the time. But the fact that we have these supply and demand incentives, these market forces, is something that corrects this disequilibrium into ultimately this equilibrium which is more sustainable. Okay? Well, what happens on the other side? What happens if price is too low? Well, if price is too low, we actually have the opposite thing. We have a situation where the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, or we have what economists refer to as excess demand, or simply a shortage, right? We're all familiar with this idea of a shortage, okay? But just like in the surplus situation, these quantities, or in this case, this lack of quantity, conveys information, right? Markets and prices convey these information to get people back toward that equilibrium. So these low prices give buyers an incentive to buy more, right? That's out of the law of demand. And out of the law of supply, sellers want to sell less at lower prices, right? So sellers have an incentive to produce less, okay? And so ultimately, okay, this sort of gets us we have this shortage, and so what happens is at this low price, okay, we have room for the price to go up, right? How do we know this? Well, at this price, people demand 95 million barrels of oil, and at this price, people only want to sell 24 million barrels of oil, so there's far fewer sellers than there are buyers of this particular good, right? And so as prices start to go up, right, they know, sellers of this oil, they know, hey, if all of our inventory goes super fast, and it seems like there's a lot of buyers left over, our next day, we're just going to say, okay, the stuff that we produce tomorrow, we're just going to push up the price a bit more. And as they push up the price a bit more, and they're still selling out every time, right? You still keep pushing the price up, and sellers keep buying it up until the point at which supply equals demand, okay? This is all, again, out of people's self-interest. They're just taking cues from the market because markets and prices convey information which are useful to sort of nudge us in this direction towards efficiency and equilibrium. So ultimately, as I said, sellers know the price is too low, and they respond, right? Quantities and prices, they are, conveying information. How do we know we're in a shortage? Well, we see lines. We see back orders, right? As I mentioned, that if you sell out very quickly, you see people, you see back orders, you see, people coming to your store and saying, hey, I thought you had this stuff in stock. And that itself is information that says, hey, you should be pushing up your price, right? And ultimately, sellers may do this. Do they always do this? No, right? Some of you have been very frustrated and have waited in lines before. So sometimes sellers try to take the gamble, at least a long-run gamble, that these lines or these shortages, not huge shortages, you don't want the shortage to be too big, right? These shortages make their product look exclusive, make their product, people want to sort of get the product first and so forth. Apple was famous for doing this with their launch of the iPhone. They would have fewer on the market initially than how many people demanded it, and then there would be this time period where you try to, get the product and you can't for a while, and then eventually you get it because it's on back order, right? So there are some strategic cases where individual firms are able to sort of get their product out. Generally, that's more of the exception, not the rule. Generally, people, if they see an opportunity to raise their price, they will. And in fact, you have very expensive phones. The last phone that I bought was actually quite expensive. And I was able to get it on the release date. So this might be something that Apple and other companies are sort of moving away from, because there's a profitable opportunity. Each one of these people who goes to the Apple store and doesn't get the phone is a potential customer to go to some other store and get another phone, right? Because they're like, hey, it's time for me to get a new phone, and if I can't get the iPhone, maybe I'm going to get some other phone, right? So it's potentially a profitable opportunity lost. And so you, as a seller, may be taking a gamble when you sort of don't raise your price when there's a shortage. So what we learn here in how prices inform our behavior is sort of a very important lesson from markets, which we shouldn't really take for granted, which also falls from very, I think, basic principles where generally buyers and sellers respond in ways that seem very intuitive, right? Ultimately, when we have these sort of equilibrium outcomes, right, it creates essentially some order out of chaos. Okay, this is sort of this idea of spontaneous order out of what F.A. Hayek was talking about, right, which I mentioned previously. That through their self-interest, basically nobody's sort of telling people that you have to raise prices when there's a shortage of something. The government isn't saying when there's a surplus that you have to slash your prices, right? But people end up doing this and over again, and this process emerges out of this sort of chaotic kind of way, right? This chaotic situation spontaneously, okay? And this is a pretty cool part of markets, okay? My last point about spontaneous order and sort of this self-interest is that sort of in a broader context, right, when we talked about these different economic systems, is that this is precisely the thing that other centrally planned economies tried to mimic but had a hard time doing, right? Because it turned out that this economy that emerges out of self-interest or out of these market forces is incredibly dynamic, and it's incredibly efficient to manage all of our sort of resources, right? That in a centrally planned economy, you may not have all this information in real time, right? In a centrally planned economy, you saw in the old Soviet Union and currently in sort of North Korea and other places, you saw shortages all over the place. But it's in part when the government ran the entire economy, they had a difficult time in sort of managing all of this information because they didn't have prices, right? In a centrally planned economy, or at least you don't have prices that are meaningful or they're determined by markets. They had prices, but they were sort of arbitrary, and everything was set by the government, and they didn't take into account all of these different kinds of dynamics that we're talking about, where sellers and buyers are constantly interacting with one another and sort of reacting to all these shortages and surpluses and information these prices are providing, right? Because they didn't have this available to them, they're at a tremendous disadvantage. And it turned out that this market that was created, that emerged, right, tended to be very efficient in a way that centrally planned economies couldn't really match. So why is it important that markets sort of create order from the bottom up? Well, as I said, if people don't have prices to guide their behavior, people don't necessarily have the information or the incentive to take care of these shortages and surpluses, right? This is one of the issues that people discuss in our current market for healthcare, right? In the United States and in other countries, you have a lot of people who get their healthcare through insurance and private insurers. And so when they go to the hospital or they go to outpatient medical care facilities, right? You go to your doctor, you may not necessarily know what things cost or what sort of trade-offs you may have. And as a result, you have shortages and surpluses and different things because you don't quite have that information, those prices that are sort of guiding you. Now, in certain cases, that's probably pretty good, right? If you're having a heart attack, it's not really relevant that you have, you know the price of the hospital that's going to charge you for taking care of that heart attack, right, or for treating you. Right? But for other cases where you can shop around and where prices can help allocate resources, in some cases you might have doctors' offices jack up their prices when they have a lot of people who want to go there, right? Who want to go to a particular office because they're strained. And in the other case, you might have doctors' offices that are lowering their prices because they have a bunch of doctors sitting around and they have a surplus of doctors, and they're like, look, we're trying to signal to the market, take advantage of our services because we have this inventory, right? In centrally planned economies, or even in aspects of our own economy where prices aren't very active, right? You get these surpluses and these shortages not sort of guiding these market forces in ways that are useful. So ultimately, even though prices, they sort of seem kind of benign, or they seem just sort of like just something that you have to deal with, from an economic standpoint, they're extraordinarily useful, and they're a way in which our whole market seems to thrive. Okay. The final point that I want to communicate in this lecture, even though I've sort of gone on and on about prices and information, is this point that that Adam Smith made about sort of self-interest, right? And it's a point that I sort of discussed in one of the previous lectures, about sort of the motivation behind what's going on here, right? Adam Smith, again, said, it's not for the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own self-interest. And we address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and we never talk of them but our own necessities, but of their advantages, right? Ultimately, when we're in a market, it's not the fact that the butcher, the baker, or the brewer loves us. It's just that they want to make money. They want to feed their own families, and in doing so, they feed us, right? And we don't go to the butcher, the baker, and the brewer, and to get our sandwich and our beer, to say like, look, like please, out of your love for humanity, provide this to me. You go to them and you ask and you say, look, I have something to trade, and what I have to trade is something that I've made. I've put some work into something, right, which I've exchanged for money, and which I've brought this money to you, and you're going to exchange something to me, right? And that's largely how this process works. It's through this sort of this self-interest, people trying to make money, and prices and markets responding as a result. Okay? We already talked about in the previous lecture the invisible hand, but this is sort of illustrating further what market forces do. Okay, so we talked about Adam Smith and his invisible hand. It's not only through self-interest, but it's also these market forces are in some ways more complex than we can even comprehend individually, but we still take part of this system in a broader one, which our intentions don't necessarily match the outcomes. Okay? Ultimately, you get people providing stuff for other people, even if they don't know them, or if they have no intention of making somebody else better off. But as a result of you exchanging with them, you are making them better off. And that's why they say thank you to you, and you say thank you to them, despite the fact that you're gaining and they're gaining. Okay? So can we do better than this? Can we do better than this market equilibrium? Well, maybe, maybe not, right? If the market equilibrium that emerges isn't one that we like, okay, maybe the prices seem unfairly low or unfairly high, that might be something that we may want to try to address, right? So for example, what if we thought that the market for labor, okay, wages, wasn't enough? Well, wages are determined by supply and demand. Some people seem to have a wage that seems unfair. So one solution would be a minimum wage or a price floor, right? And this is exactly something that we can examine with the tools that we've got, right? And so we can then sort of examine, okay, well, what if the price is different from the equilibrium? And how does the market, how can we potentially even do better than the market? Or how can we have unintended consequences that we may want to examine further?